Your questions on the problem of evil here on the 1-year anniversary of the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As you heard in the opening, it's our 1-year anniversary. Can you believe it? I can hardly believe it. Really, it's been 1 year. And you know what? I have to thank all of you. As always, I always thank you, my listeners here on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. I'm so grateful for you tuning in. I'm so grateful for your many comments and for all the encouragement you send my way for your support. But today, on this 1-year anniversary, I want to thank and offer a special thanks to all 2,805 subscribers. Well, there might be more by the time this drops. But anyway, as of right now, while I'm recording, that's how many we have. So maybe in celebration of this 1-year anniversary, go tell your friends, shake some trees. Let's see if we can break 3,000 or just hit 3,000. We don't have to break it. 3,001, that's too ambitious. Maybe just 3,000 here before next week's episode. Let's see. Can we do it? I don't know. You tell me. Well, today, as noted in our introduction, as promised, we're going to go ahead and look at your questions on the problem of evil. So we just finished up our series on the problem of evil, a 5-part series. I think probably about 11 or 12 hours of content there. And along the way, you folks asked questions, and I invited you to do that, specifically because I wanted to be able to weigh in on any lingering, burning questions that may have been missed along the way. And so I have your questions here ready for me. Actually, my producer has your questions here ready for me. I'm going into this blind, as I typically do in these Q&A sessions, and so this will all be off the cuff, genuine, authentic Q&A with Dr. Jacobs. But actually, what we're going to start with is producer's prerogative. So my producer actually does have the prerogative of kicking off with a question that she has. And so we will start by hearing her question. So let's see, what do we got here? Jumping in. A large portion of the framework of human evil is easily answered as it being a consequence of human freedom, not divine planning. Yet the crucifixion, central to our salvation, seems to have required specific acts of evil, the unjust torture and execution of Christ. How do you reconcile this tension? If God's redemptive plan needed these particular acts of injustice and cruelty, doesn't this complicate the idea that evil is merely a byproduct of our free choices rather than something somehow necessary within God's design? All right. Well, okay. So in terms of this question, this is a great question. It's a question that oftentimes emerges specifically with somebody like Judas. Well, if the redemption of humanity in some ways hangs upon Christ being betrayed and crucified and things like that, doesn't that mean in some ways Judas was bound by some type of necessity or something like that in order to betray Christ? And doesn't this actually violate the concept that human freedom is really the source of that evil? So there's a couple of different things that I think are important to explore here. The first is that and hopefully this isn't too technical. I mean, what are we talking about? Me, technical, this podcast, never. But there are various forms of necessity that are actually talked about in the medieval period. So there's a recognition throughout medieval philosophy that we can use the word necessary in any number of ways. And and this is part of what gives rise to the scholastic distinction between, say, for example, the necessity of the consequence versus the necessity of the consequent. So that's just one example of two different types of necessity. And when asking this question, the thing that they recognize that is really important is it's important when using the word necessary that you're defining what type of necessity that we're talking about. So let's just give an example of two types of necessity. Let's say, for example, that you're in a room, right? And you're in a room with a series of doors. So door 1, door 2, door 3. And behind each door, there is a chef, right? And that as long as it's a breakfast of some kind. And so chef number one, he decides to make some Belgian waffles. Chef number two decides to make some type of eggs Benedict, let's say. And then chef number three ends up making a very sort of traditional bacon and eggs type breakfast, okay? Now, the thing is, we could talk about the fact that if you pick door number one, then you will get Belgian waffles. If you pick door number two, you'll get eggs Benedict. If you pick door number three, you'll get bacon and eggs. Okay, and that if-then relationship does identify a certain type of necessity. Picking door number one carries the necessity that you will get that thing that the chef has chosen to make. This is what's called a necessity of the consequence. And here it's referring to in logic, if A, then B. Right? So you will have necessity, the necessity of the consequence, if then. If you pick door number one, you'll get Belgian waffles. Okay. But notice that that type of necessity doesn't in any way violate freedom. So there's no necessity in you choosing door number A. Or door number one, I said 1, 2, and 3, right? I didn't say A, B, and C. Okay, so there's no necessity in you choosing door number one. And there's also freedom in the sense of whatever the chef wanted to make. He didn't have to make Belgian waffles. So there's no violation of free will in either the chef's cooking or in your choosing. Both are free. But there's still a necessary entanglement, right? A necessary consequence that if you pick number one, you get what he's choosing. But that necessity is perfectly harmonious with your free choice. Now, the contrast, of course, is a necessity of the consequent. And the necessity of the consequent here, again, this is another term in logic. So in an if-then relationship, if A, then B, the antecedent is the A, and the consequent is the resulting thing, the B, right? So if A, then B. And so if you were saying that the chef has to choose Belgian waffles, or if you're saying that you have to choose door number one, if you're saying that your choosing and his choosing couldn't be otherwise, then you're actually saying you getting Belgian waffles is in some ways necessary in an absolute sense. And this actually does violate free will. And so in many ways, what happens is the medievals are rightly pointing out, well, it depends on what you mean that it's necessary, right? Because some types of necessity are perfectly harmonious with free choice and contrary possibilities and things like that. This is actually supremely relevant to things like the foreknowledge problem. So a lot of people will freak out, right? Now, the foreknowledge problem is basically like this worry that says, well, if God's infallible and he knows for certain that tomorrow morning I'm going to eat breakfast. I don't know why we're on a breakfast theme, but that's just what we're on. But if it's the case that God foreknows that I'm going to eat breakfast tomorrow, then in some sense it's necessary that I eat breakfast tomorrow, and then I don't have free will. And that's sort of the basis. That's a very colloquial, simple version of what's called the foreknowledge problem. The worry that foreknowledge in some ways undermines free will. And that wasn't unique to Christianity, right? Like Cicero writes an entire treatise where he's worried about the idea that oracles and divination somehow undermine free will, which then undermines justice and moral responsibility and things like that. But again, the understanding, this is actually part of the context in which the medievals discuss this sort of thing. The whole point for drawing a distinction between, say, the necessity of the consequence and the necessity of the consequent is in order to say that there are certain types of necessity that are perfectly compatible with freedom. And so in the case of the foreknowledge problem, it functions as a necessity of the consequence. God foreknowing the future, it's necessary as a consequence, that whatever you choose to do corresponds to what he knows. Just like it's necessary that if you choose door number one, whatever the chef has chosen behind door number one is what you get. But that type of correspondence doesn't indicate necessity in either your choice or in God's knowing. Because had you chosen otherwise, then God's knowing would be otherwise. And so there's a fluidity or a contingency in both the choosing and in the knowing, in the sense that both could be otherwise. And so in this sense, the necessity that they coincide doesn't actually undermine free will. And the reason this is important is because this does go to certain things that we tend to mistake when talking about, say like the betrayal of Judas or something like that. There's a tendency to think that because the prophecies about Christ's crucifixion and the redemption of humanity involve a traitor, that they involve him being born in, Bethlehem, because they involve him being called a Nazarene, because they involve him being crucified, that being the means of his execution, because they involve these sort of specific things, that in some ways that what that means is that the only death that would have been redemptive is crucifixion, that the only way that death could have come about is through a traitor who's, one of his own, that the only way it could have come about is through him being born in Bethlehem. And yet, that's actually not the case, right? This is where what you're actually talking about is you're talking about necessities of the consequence. So it's necessary that the prophecies coincide with what happens, but that doesn't mean that everything had to happen in exactly that sort of way. And this goes to an area of providence, according to the Eastern Fathers, that I talked about in previous episodes, which is that there is, within the Eastern Fathers, this tendency to see divine providence as genuinely interactive, genuinely a true sense of self-determination. Self-determination is just so incredibly pervasive in how the Eastern Fathers talk about God-world interactions. I would point you, for example, to Basil of Caesarea's homily on why God is not the author of evil. And the term self-determination, and the talk of self-determination, is us being the cause of evil and things like that, is just pervasive in the way Basil handles that. But it also goes to this sort of dynamic, this real dynamic interplay, where what providence is doing is it's dealing with the realities of self-determination. That the road that that our story takes is genuinely contributed to by us, as opposed to, say, this sort of Molinistic middle knowledge type thing that I talked about in the Latin West, where God just has a schematic and it's sort of a choose your own adventure, and he's really sort of making our choices for us. You don't find that sort of thing in the Eastern Fathers. And candidly, I don't think you find it in Scripture. So one of the things, I'll use an example here of something that I always think illustrates this incredibly profoundly, which is when Israel decides that they want a king. And so for those of you who know the story of the choosing of the first king, right, of King Saul, you know that that at the time Israel was a theocracy. So they had a king. It was God. And the people come to the prophet Samuel, the seer, who is the mouth of God, speaking on behalf of God, delivering to them the words of God. And they tell him, we would like to have a king like the other nations. We want to be like the other nations. And Samuel is rightly scandalized. You have a king. The Lord your God is your king, that sort of thing. And they say they want a king with, flesh and blood. And so Samuel says he'll take these words to their king. And he delivers those words to God, which obviously God already knows this, but God tells Samuel, well, warn them. Tell them what a king comes, what a king will bring to them, right? Tell them that he'll tax them. He'll take their daughters for bakers. He'll take their sons to war. He'll take their lands, and just tell them about these sorts of things and see if they still want a king. And if they do want a king, then give them a king. And that's the shocker part of the story, right? Because you would expect God would say, and if they say they still want a king, then I'm going to smite them. But instead God says, then give them a king. And Samuel comes to them, and he delivers the words of God, and he warns them, and they say, yes, we still want a king. And Samuel says, okay, I'll give you a king. And then he does this peculiar thing where he says, okay, I want you to judge me. Right? And he asks them quite plainly, have I ever taken a bribe? Have I ever engaged in unjust dealings when it comes to you, or so on? And they're shocked and confused, and they say, well, no, of course, you've done none of these things. He says, very good. Now gird yourself as men. Gird your loins like men, and I'm going to judge you. And he tells them what a wicked thing they did when they asked for a king, because you have a king. The Lord your God is your king. And then what the shocking part of the story is to me at that point, the thing that I think illustrates this so well, is that you would think in a very sort of rigid view of divine providence, where God just has certain designs, and we have to abide by those designs. And if we diverge from those designs, well, we're forever outside of the will of God or something like that. What Samuel says, after, of course, calling down wind and rain and storm to terrify them and let them know what a wicked thing they've done by asking for a king, he then says that if they and their king obey, it'll go well with them, and God will bless them, and he'll protect them from their enemies, deliver them from their hand. And that part is the part that is really, truly shocking. Because for those of us who have a very sort of rigid view of divine providence, a very rigid view that says, well, God has these designs. You are in lockstep with those designs. If you diverge from those designs, you're outside of the will of God. You would expect that the result would be, when the people say we've done wrong, we've sinned, right? They're terrified, that the answer would be good. Take it back. Let's go back to being a theocracy. But instead what God does is he goes ahead and he allows them to make that wrong, sinful, wicked choice. And then he begins to weave his designs and his desires, his providential aim for their good through those plans, so that now they will have a king. And eventually, God will become that incarnate king over them, being their king once again. But the road now looks very different because they've asked for a king of flesh and blood. And I think that's the sort of thing that really does sort of illustrate the extent to which God genuinely allows us to make choices. He genuinely allows us to engage in self-determination. And I think there's a lot of things like that in that story. I've talked about the fact that with Saul, part of the question is, why does God make Saul king if he knows he's eventually going to regret making Saul king? And the reason, looking at somebody like Tertullian, and you can see hints of similar sorts of things. I think it's in Basil. Might be in Origin. But anyway, like that, Tertullian's answer is that basically God deals with us according to things that are real and present now. So Saul is a good choice for king. He doesn't look out into the future and say, well, Saul's eventually going to make bad choices and become a bad king, and therefore I'm not going to make him king now. Rather, he deals with Saul on the basis of what's real now, which is that Saul right now is a good choice for king. And later, he'll make bad choices, and God will regret that. But God doesn't deal with us now on the basis of those future bad choices, just like, with the baby Hitler sort of a scenario. Would you kill baby Hitler if you could, right? And the right answer is no. It's just a baby. He's not the Hitlerian villain that you know. And so I say all that in order to say that when you're looking at these sorts of questions, like the crucifixion, the betrayal, things like that, there's a very real sense in which, there are certain types of necessity that do take hold. It's necessary that the prophecies are fulfilled, but this is a necessity of the consequence. It's not a necessity that undermines free will, but coheres with it. And yes, there may well be that it's necessary that the Son of God suffer and that he die, and that is part of the journey. But of course, I don't think it's actually necessary that it has to be these very poetic parallels that happen. The fact that Adam takes from a tree and then the second Adam is hung on a tree. Those things are certainly there and come through symbolically. And so I have no doubt that God is very intentional through the midst of human choices. That, of course, is something that, God being an excellent storyteller does tend to do those things. But those things don't impose upon the event some type of necessity that says it has to be done in this particular way. It has to be Judas who betrays him. No doubt, if you read the story through the lens of the Eastern Fathers, where part of what happens is the fishhook theory, which I think I talk about this in one of the episodes, specifically when I'm talking about the Eastern patristic narrative. But according to the Eastern Fathers, part of the narrative that you have is that because Christ, the Son of God, is entering enemy territory, the god of this world, the devil, is the one who sees him and is enticed by the prospect of being able to finally wound and attack and even kill God, his primary enemy. The devil is the main one driving forward, this plot against the Son of God in the narrative. And so even though Judas becomes a pawn in this, right, someone who Satan enters, right, who he entices and energizes in order to betray Christ, even though the Jews and then the Romans all end up playing their own part in this crucifixion, I don't think what you have there is you have any sort of necessity that says every detail of it has to play out in this way. Every person who is involved has to make this particular choice. Is it necessary that at some point Christ undergoes a martyrdom at the hands of the God of this world? Sure. But does it have to look exactly like that in all those specific ways? I don't think it does. And I don't think those are the sorts of the necessities that are there. And in this sense, what I would say is I would say that there is a certain type of fluidity that takes place here where it is perhaps, let's say, inevitable, given the realities of the devil himself, that he will ultimately try to kill the Son of God. I don't think there's anything about that is questionable, just like it's not questionable for God that Pharaoh, being a proud man, when God shows up and tells him that he's no God at all, right? And that he himself, right, when the God of the Hebrews tells him that he's the real God, that Pharaoh is going to harden and crack and resist. God knows these things because they're grounded in a certain reality that's there. And so in the same way, the world having fallen, there's a certain reality to the nature of the devil and the demonic powers and their hatred for God that grounds the inevitability of the Son of God being handed over to the powers that be in order to be killed. But does that mean that every detail of that every choice has to be exactly as it is? No. And as for those things that are foreknown, like I said, these are things that are a necessity of a different kind, the necessity of the consequence, to use the Latin scholastic term, which is, in fact, compatible with freedom. So there you go, producer. I hope that addresses the question. I wonder if they're all going to be this sort of a complicated. We'll see. We'll see what else we've got on the docket. But there we go, one out of the gate. What do we have next? Okay, well, actually, I'm being told here that because I've brought up Saul, that we do have two questions related to the story of Saul. So may as well jump to those next. What a happy accident we have there. Okay, so let's see. The first question is this. In 1 Samuel, 1 Kingdoms, 23, by the way, people who aren't familiar with that, in the Septuagint, you actually have, rather than 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, you have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Kingdoms. All right. So 1 Samuel, 1 Kingdoms, 23, God tells David that Saul will come and the people of Keilah will deliver David and his men to Saul. So David and his men leave, and they are not captured. If I am understanding properly that God knows the future because the future actually happens, how does God know that the people of Keilah will sell out David? Or is it more of an educated prediction based on God's knowledge of the people's hearts? Or is there another way to understand this? Thanks. Really enjoying this series. Hey, thanks. Thank you. All right, so this is specifically related to the entire understanding of divine foreknowledge that, well, I actually just did a Jacob's in Brief, our first ever Jacob's in Brief episode that was related to that concept, right, and to the understanding of divine foreknowledge that I suggest you find in the Eastern Church Fathers. Just by way of just quick context on this, for anybody who hasn't listened to that one or listened to the audio letter on why would God make the damned, the basic concept here, what I've suggested, is that what you see made very explicit in John of Damascus is that God knows things that are, right? And so when you're talking about the sort of question of whether or not God knows somebody, when you presume, for example, that God knows somebody will be damned if he makes them, and then he chooses to make them, and so on. And John of Damascus thinks this actually creates an inverted procedure in terms of God's choices and God's knowing. That before God chooses to make a creature and give to that creature self-determination, including the self-determination of whether to be damned, they're not a thing to be known at all. And so his knowledge of their future damnation is a knowledge of something that is real, which follows from his choice to make them and from their own self-determination. So that's the whole point that I've made there. And then in the Jacob's in Brief, I talk about the fact that that John of Damascus is not the only one who says that. It is the sort of thing, I think I said it was Basil, and I think I attributed it to the letter Epistle 233 because I was just going off of memory. That does happen, by the way. I don't have a bunch of notes in front of me. I'm not. I am doing these things just from memory and off the cuff in terms of walking through these topics when I do these episodes. So my citation and attributions are all just sort of pulling from memory, and every now and then it does happen. I think I attributed something to Philo of Alexandria. In a few episodes back, that was actually a Neo-Pythagorean quote. Anyway, so that was incorrect. It's not Basil's letter 233. I looked back on that. I was actually thinking of something in Gregory of Nyssa's Contra Eunomius, and then, and anyway, doesn't matter. That was a long aside. The point is that what I had argued is that John of Damascus is explicit about this, and that when you look at the Eastern Fathers, one of the things that you find consistently across writers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen, as well as Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, and others, what you find consistently is that they understand foreknowledge to not be causal, and what they understand it to be knowledge of is things that are future. And so in this sense, what you don't find there is some sort of hypothetical knowledge, where it's that God knows these hypothetical futurities that would be if, and then makes his choices based on that. Rather, they tend to link his foreknowledge of the future with foresight, foreseeing things that will be, and in this sense have some sort of ontological grounding. And this is raised for a number of folks. Well, what about these sort of hypothetical futurities? And this is one drawn from, the story of David, where God warns them in particular about something that will happen. I actually talk about this in my appearance on Faith Unaltered, where I also did an interview on this topic. And here's what I would say. Again, the point with the Eastern Fathers, I'd say a couple of things. The first is the same thing I said there, which is it would be quite a stretch to extrapolate from God saying that if this happens, then this will happen in that circumstance. If you go there, this is what they'll do to you. It would be quite a stretch to go from that to saying that God has middle knowledge, where he has a bunch of, without him ever choosing to make any of these worlds or beings or whatever, has in his mind a bunch of hypothetical beings and worlds and futurities and things like that, like some choose-your-own-adventure novel. I don't think you could derive that just from that. And then one of the reasons I think you couldn't derive it from that is because, once again, in keeping with what I've said about the Eastern Fathers, they understand God's knowledge to be of things that are. And so even though there is, what's being talked about here is a hypothetical, right, futurity, a counterfactual. If you go there, this will happen. This is how they'll handle you. That is still grounded in something that is real, right? God knows that people, and knowing that people, he knows something about their disposition toward David or toward the Hebrews or whatever it might be. And so in this sense, I would not say that knowledge is in some ways groundless or of some non-substantial hypothetical futurity that has no grounding in reality. Rather, what you have here is you have a knowledge of certain things that are real, a knowledge of those people, a knowledge of their disposition. And so in the same way, what you actually do have is something very similar to what I just talked about, that it's because God knows Pharaoh. He knows that this man believes that he is a god. He knows that he is a man of monstrous pride, and he knows that when I show up and I tell him that I'm the real God, that is not going to go well, and Pharaoh is going to harden and crack because he is prideful. I know that is what that heart is like. I know that that's what's in that heart of his. So I don't think that means that you can't, God can't have any knowledge of anything regarding, what would be if, when you're talking about certain realities, certain beings or things like that. And the Eastern Fathers do talk this way, right? You do have certain things that they find that they'll reference, for example, with like Tyre and Zidon, right? Like, well, one of the things that Christ is clearly doing is he's indicting his hearers, saying, well, like, I'm performing these miracles and you're not repenting. But if I perform these miracles for the people of Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. And that's obviously meant to be an indictment of them, that even those guys would have responded better than you. And yet, one of the natural questions that starts to emerge for people is a question of, well, like, then if they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes, why didn't God do some miracles in order to make them do that? And one of the things you do find in certain Eastern fathers is speculation like, well, he knows that their repentance would have been a shallow repentance that wouldn't have lasted. And in this sense, the second condition would have been worse than the first. Now, they don't say that dogmatically. That's sort of a type of plausible explanation. And with that, a lot of people would want to say, like, see, they have middle knowledge. But I don't think it is, it requires some sort of middle knowledge in order to say that this people is a people that will respond in radical ways to miracles. But also, their hearts are not actually virtuous. They're not interested in virtue. And so if they respond to those miracles, it'll be a superficial response that will be, in reaction to a sort of like a magic trick, basically. But that's not going to turn into virtue, because that's not what their hearts are all about. That's not what they're like. That's not what they're interested in. Their repentance would be a superficial one, and the second condition would be worse than the first. I don't think you need a full-blown theory of middle knowledge in order to say that sort of thing. And like I said, I think the fact of the matter is that in all of these sorts of instances where the Eastern Fathers are talking about these sort of what would be if, they're still talking about things that are real. They're talking about real people with real dispositions, with real inclinations and so on. And God's knowledge seems to be grounded in those realities. And that is really, at the end of the day, the entire point about the Eastern patristic view of foreknowledge. So that actually wouldn't be foreknowledge, right? They wouldn't identify that as foreknowledge because it is not knowledge of some futurity, but it is knowledge of the being itself. And from that knowledge of the creature, of the substance of the creature, of the disposition of the creature, comes a certain understanding of the nature of that creature and what would follow under certain conditions. I think you do have that sort of thing. And I don't think that's problematic. But like I said, that's not a full-blown theory of middle knowledge like it's developed by the Spanish Jesuits and used by a lot of folks today. Okay, let's see. What is our second question here related to Saul? The example of Saul is helpful for understanding divine foreknowledge. However, I have some doubts, okay? You contrast human utilitarian decision-making with God's and suggest that God's actions in the Saul example don't make sense if we see him as a deontologist. But in the baby Hitler example, isn't the reasoning you don't kill baby Hitler because you don't kill innocent human beings based on a deontological principle like don't kill innocent people? I've always understood contemporary ethics as presenting the deontology versus utilitarianism dilemma, but could this be another false dilemma? Okay, so this is a great question. One of the things I've been considering doing is actually just an episode on ethics. There's definitely a person, I'm going to nudge him here, James Joyner of Northern Arizona University, who owes me a couple of appearances, and he's somebody I wanted to do at least one ethics episode with. But I've also thought about doing an episode on ethics just in general and applying ethics to contemporary topics, contemporary disputes, looking at those through the lens of various ethical systems. So if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments. I mean, I'm planning on doing it regardless, but I'm always interested in knowing what you think. I will say here, okay, so in terms of this, I do think, let's just define a couple of terms just in case. I gather that the questioner has at least some familiarity with deontology and utilitarianism, but I don't want to presume everybody listening does. So let's just start there. So utilitarianism is is an ethic that was really sort of developed over time, like John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Bentham, which was basically, it was sort of born out of that later modernist sort of push for nominalism, and which then sort of gave rise to the sort of empiricism. And with that, one of the things that you ran into was just the sort of question of, well, what do you mean by good and evil? And they can no longer talk about, sort of forms and teleology the way the realists did. They couldn't talk about, sort of transcendent values. And so good and evil really got essentially reduced down to something empirical, which was pleasure and pain. We find this pleasurable and for that reason desirable, and we find that unpleasant and therefore undesirable. And so that was kind of what good and evil ended up being reduced down to. And then this was sort of veiled and packaged by talking about happiness. But again, happiness in the utilitarian sense, which is largely the contemporary sense when most people use the word happy, meant, just generally feeling pretty good, a generally pleasant state of affairs, more pleasure than pain. Whereas in ancient times, the way somebody like Aristotle uses happiness, for example, is definitely not that, right? It has to do with something having to do with well-being, right? Having to do with the nature that you have and proper formation and things like that. So a very different concept of happiness in the ancients and the medievals than what you get with the utilitarians. But for that reason, what starts to happen is the interest, again, and this is part of the scientism that was born out of empiricism, was that they wanted something that they could calculate, right? Quantifiable, something that's empirical. And so for this reason, there was an interest in developing, like a calculus of sensuousness, for example. I didn't invent that term, by the way. But the idea was, essentially the idea was that maybe what we can do over time, the hope of a lot of the sort of different departments, academic departments that were developed, like anthropology and sociology, were aimed at this hope of saying, well, maybe what we can do is we can begin to start to quantify these sort of, different acts in a certain way and determine in a quantifiable way what the sort of measure of pleasure to pain is, and in this sense start to create a certain sort of scientific morality. And then also if we analyze human behavior, sociology, in anthropology, what we can do is we can start to figure out what makes humans tick so that we can basically reverse engineer that, and we can start to manipulate humans socially in order to behave in ways that are more conducive toward the good, i.e. pleasure, and over time engineer a utopia. That probably sounds like I'm caricaturing it. It's absolutely not. If you start in people like Auguste Comte and work your way forward, this is 100% what utilitarianism is about. And so, yes, those departments were developed for specifically social engineering purposes. That was the aim of the philosophy. Now, for that reason, contextualizing that in terms of utilitarian ethics, what you ended up having is an act was judged moral or immoral based on just the outcome and whether or not the outcome was pleasurable or unpleasurable, desirable or undesirable in that sort of sense. And this is where, if you've ever heard the sort of like common parlance of the ends justify the means, that's sort of a sort of bumper sticker version of utilitarianism, where you're saying like, look, I know this is a horrible thing that we're going to do here, but, at the end of the day, the result we get is this, and that's really great. Overall, happiness is increased. And this is where people of a more classical mindset, in terms of ethics, always found that to be obviously morally repugnant and indefensible, because they believed that morality was not merely pleasure and pain, that the sort of goods that we detect by our moral intuitions are not just about that sort of utilitarian outcome. Utility being their usefulness in bringing about a pleasant state of affairs. That's the utilitarian part. And so this is the sort of thing. If you want a popular example of critiques of this, you could watch actually Woody Allen's movie High Crimes and Misdemeanors. And I won't blow the ending. We've all had plenty of time to watch it. It's a very old movie, probably older than some of the great many people who listen to this podcast. But I used to show that every now and then in an ethics class, specifically because when you get to the ending, what you run into the dilemma of is what one of the characters is saying would mean that a certain series of events, which your moral intuitions will tell you is obviously repugnant, is morally justified if you're a utilitarian. And that sort of thing, that's normally how you engage in sort of critical thinking about ethics. Ethics is really largely sort of a reverse engineering exercise where somebody's positing a theory that says this is the schematic of how morality works. And then you start to test it, right? And if it aligns with what your moral intuitions are telling you, then that's a plausible explanation of the structures of good and evil. Whereas if obviously you can run through that certain scenarios that are clearly morally repugnant and it passes, then obviously there's something wrong with that system. And this would be the sort of thing, like you can find all sorts of examples contra utilitarianism, like that you have a bunch of people who are important to society, who are, have families, who are who have important jobs, who are, whatever it is. And then you have this one poor lowly janitor. I think I used this explanation in a different podcast once upon a time, who doesn't have any family, and he's in their midst. And that poor lowly janitor has all healthy organs, and all the other people who are surrounding him, who have more family members and are much more important than him in their societal role. They each have a deadly disease, but that deadly disease for each one of them affects a different organ. So if they collectively just killed the janitor, harvested his organs, distributed them accordingly, then you would increase the overall happiness, because the important people with lots of families are now all happy because they have their healthy organs, and the lowly janitor, there's nobody who misses him. And so under utilitarianism, you could certainly justify that sort of thing. And most people look at that and go, "Oh, I don't think that would be right." And so all of a sudden there's something very suspect about utilitarian ethics. And I should say here, utilitarianism, there's sort of different forms of it, whether or not it's about overall social happiness or the happiness of the individual, but that's kind of immaterial to what we're talking about, just to acknowledge it. Now, deontology is typically associated with somebody like Immanuel Kant. It's actually borderline synonymous with Immanuel Kant. And deontology is really sort of this ethic where what you're trying to do is you're trying to create moral maxims, right? Moral rules that can be universally applied to everybody. And there's various ways in which Kant formulates what he calls the categorical imperative, which is the underlying mandate that sits behind these. But the idea is you imagine whether or not your rule was enacted as a universal rule for all people of all places at all times, and see whether or not it functions. So, for example, lying is a very easy one, because if you mandate that everybody should lie, then what happens is suddenly everybody knows what's being said is false, and so lying becomes in some ways meaningless, and so there emerges a sort of reductio ad absurdum when you test that maxim. So deontology is sort of known for its rigidity, though. This is one of the things that's oftentimes critiqued for, is its rigidity in, suggesting that, lying is never permissible under any circumstances. And so, if you have, Jews hiding in your floorboards and the Nazis show up, and they're like, "Are you hiding Jews?" You should be like, "Yeah, of course, I'm hiding Jews. I can't lie." And that's the sort of thing where deontology is sometimes critiqued. Now, what I will say is that the questioner is absolutely correct to think that this is a false dichotomy, because there are a lot more ethical systems than just deontology and utilitarianism. And so, for example, you have virtue ethics, which is sort of thing typically associated with Aristotle, that what morality is about is forming a certain type of moral character, or forming the individual through repetition habits. You have natural law, which suggests that each thing has a certain form, or telos, a form that carries a telos, and that we can analyze the proper ends of things, and that basically when we're talking about what is right and wrong, good and evil, what we're talking about is whatever those things are that are conducive to the proper formation of the well-being of the thing. You have ethical egoism. You have divine command theory. So you have any number of ethical systems, and it would be a false dichotomy to say, just utilitarianism or deontology, as if those are the only two options. And so my point when talking about how God doesn't operate as a utilitarian, first of all, speaking from the perspective of the Eastern Church Fathers, yes, God does not operate as a utilitarian. And there's a couple of reasons for this, partially because, again, it seems like that when you're talking about the Eastern Church Fathers and ethics, there's a certain type of natural law at work. It's not identical to the type of natural law that you might find in somebody like Thomas Aquinas, but it is still a natural law in the sense that there is a certain structure and order to the nature of things, and that structure and order of things carries with it a certain proper end or teleology that constitutes the well-being of the thing. And God's interest in the good of the thing is an interest in moving things is toward that well-being. And those terms are all meaningful in a way that is not reducible to pleasure and pain. So in that sense, 100%. God is not a utilitarian because he's not dealing in just pleasure and pain. So that's one thing. The other thing about this is that the specific context in which I was talking about utilitarianism and making sure that we're not sort of misreading God as a utilitarian is the antecedent and the consequent will of God. So the context in which I talked about the antecedent and consequent will was specifically when talking about this concept in John of Damascus that is clearly not his invention. Conceptually, it's there before him in John Chrysostom, like in his homilies on Ephesians, and it's the basis for the permissive will of God, which is just ubiquitous. Like every church father, East and West, has a concept of the permissive will of God. It's just there from the dawn of Christianity. But John of Damascus formalizes this concept in what he calls the antecedent consequent will of God. And the point of that is in order to help sort of in some ways schematize or help clarify what it means that God permits certain evils that he would not otherwise will, and forgoes certain goods that he otherwise would will. And I think this is where something like the destruction of Pharaoh is a good example for illustrating that. So when we consider, for example, Pharaoh, we can say quite clearly with the Eastern Church Fathers that God being provident and good, he desires Pharaoh's good. So he does not desire Pharaoh's destruction. He has made Pharaoh for certain ends, and those ends actually are that he becomes a saint, that he knows God, that he partakes of the divine nature, that he attains to everlasting well-being in the kingdom of heaven. And that would definitely be the sort of thing that God, being good, wills for Pharaoh and cannot not will for Pharaoh. That's actually one of the things that the Eastern Fathers are consistent on when they talk about what providence is, that God is aimed at the good of the creature, that him being good means that he can do none other than will the good of the creature. So antecedently, we can say with confidence, it's not a mystery to us, right? It's not a question mark. It's not sort of up in the air. God wills those things for Pharaoh, and for that reason also does not will his destruction. And yet Pharaoh is part of a complex web of consideration. So Pharaoh is currently, he's oppressing God's people, and God has certain obligations to those people because he has a covenant relationship with those people who Pharaoh has enslaved. And also those people and that entire relationship with that people is actually part of a broader sort of plan that God has in terms of, it is a plan that God has in terms of the redemption of all of humanity, the bringing about of the Messiah, and the redemption of the cosmos. And so Pharaoh is, once he's considered in context, he's one piece within a much larger puzzle. Now, this is where, like, the utilitarian mindset would tend in the direction of saying, and therefore, for that reason, the happiness of the whole is, much greater than the happiness of Pharaoh, and so then we can do all sorts of things to Pharaoh. We can kill him, we can destroy him, we can maim him, we can do whatever we want, it's all fine, because, that's a very small sort of blip on the happiness radar in comparison with the broader happiness. That's not actually what's going on in the antecedent consequent will. So what is going on is something more like the idea that, let's start with this. God's disposition toward Pharaoh does not change just because Pharaoh is part of this complex web. So God really does desire Pharaoh's good. And Pharaoh's, God is in some ways, by hiding himself from Pharaoh, that actually is showing Pharaoh mercy, because God knows that if he reveals himself to Pharaoh, Pharaoh being prideful and thinking himself a god, he'll harden and crack, and this will lead to his destruction. So withholding himself and hiding himself is actually a mercy toward Pharaoh. But the problem is, if God continues to remain hidden, then what will happen is people will continue to be enslaved and so on. And so in the interest of his commitments also to his people, who he also loves, and also in his interest to the broader cosmos and things like that, God has to consequently sort of forego mercy toward Pharaoh and unveil himself and tell him to let his people go and allow Pharaoh to go down this road of resistance and harden and crack and ultimately be destroyed. Now, in the midst of that, like I said, the antecedent disposition toward Pharaoh doesn't change. He still loves Pharaoh. He still desires Pharaoh's good. It's just that for right now, in the light of the other sort of consequent considerations, God has to permit these sorts of things to happen to Pharaoh because of his other duties to the other aspects of creation. Now, the other aspect of this was the thing that I talked about, that just because God, permits the destruction of Pharaoh, that doesn't mean that God abandons Pharaoh. And so, again, in a utilitarian mindset, somebody could be disposable in the interest of the whole. Whereas the Eastern patristic concept that you find in the antecedent consequent will is that God remains committed to Pharaoh. He remains committed to Pharaoh's good. And this is where you get into this aspect of the longer narrative that I've talked about, that God doesn't, just because in the short term, the interests of God's people and of the cosmos, the redemption of humanity generally, takes priority, doesn't mean that God gives up on or abandons Pharaoh. And this is where we talked about the long story. And this is the sort of thing you see come out in Origin. I want to say it's in his, it's in book 3 of Dapron Kippy, where he talks about the fact that Pharaoh has a soul, and the destruction of his body and his drowning doesn't mark the end of Pharaoh's story. He actually ends up cast into the darkness of Hades. He sits there acutely aware that he is not a god. And then his maker comes and visits him after having been crucified, and visits him with redemptive ends. And so this is the sort of thing that Origen points out. Pharaoh's story doesn't end just because he's drowned. And even though, again, as a lot of people know, a lot of people will balk because Origen has a lot of heretical, crazy ideas to be found in his text. But in the Philokalia of Origen, which is the approved and edited text by Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus, this passage is actually included. And so what you find there is this is where you find the long story. Yes, in the short term, when considering the complex web of considerations of how Pharaoh is entwined with God's people and with the redemption of the cosmos, God's interest in showing Pharaoh mercy has to be set aside, and his destruction has to be permitted. That does not mark the end of God's dealings with Pharaoh. God continues to fulfill his duties and his, love toward Pharaoh in the longer story, even if in the short term his destruction is ultimately permitted. And that is that's the sort of thing that really does differentiate one of the many things that differentiates a sort of utilitarian view from what's going on in the antecedent and consequent will of God. I would say that there's this other aspect there that I don't want to go into here at great length, because I think it will ultimately get too complicated and muddy the waters. But I'll just sort of touch on it and then point you to something else that I've published, which this is that in medieval ethics, there is sort of this wrestling with this question about the permissive will of God. And there's a finely nuanced point having to do with the difference between sort of more of a utilitarian approach, not that they would have had that language, but differentiating the sort of, I'm justified in doing whatever evil I want because I get a good outcome, and differentiating that which would be deemed unethical and vicious from the sort of thing that happens when what you have is you have a certain entanglement such that every choice you face has evils attached to it. And in this sense, the good and virtuous person looks at the consideration of that complex web of goods and evils with the interest, the object, the aim in their sort of dealings and their means and ends is to actually minimize the evil and maximize the good and the well-being of all. And that is the sort of thing that is sitting there within the antecedent consequent will of God. That's a very quick sort of high-flying picture of what's going on in those medieval ethics. If you really want to get a sense of that, you could read my Leibniz book, and I think we can link to that. I do have, I did publish all of the chapters of the Leibniz book on my Substack. I think most of them are behind a paywall. There's a certain amount of preview available, but to get the whole thing is behind a paywall. But we can link to the chapter where I actually go through that sort of medieval discussion and show its relationship to the antecedent consequent will, and why that sort of helps differentiate a more of a utilitarian approach to means and ends from the type of thing being talked about in the antecedent and consequent will of God. So, all right, let's see. What else do we have here? Oh, looks like we have another question related to utilitarianism. Let's take a look at this and see if it's redundant or whether we got something new here. If God is not a utilitarian, how is it that in the Gospels Jesus says about the blind man whom he heals that he wasn't blind because of he or his parents sinned, or because he or his parents sinned, but to show the glory of God? Isn't that an example of God choosing evil to make good out of it? Okay, so I don't think this would be redundant at all. Okay. So in this passage, let's talk about this passage and just, first of all, I'd say a couple of things that I think are important to understand here. The one is that, again, I'm going from memory on this. I don't have the text in front of me, but I'm pretty sure in the Greek, this passage does not have the in order that. I'm pretty sure in the Greek it just says neither this man's, neither his mother nor his father sinned, but let God be glorified. I'm pretty sure that that's how it is in the Greek. I could be wrong, again, just going from memory here. But I do think the in order that creates this sort of like causal impression that God like caused this guy to be blind so that he could have somebody to heal or something like that, is something that comes through in the translation and isn't in the original text. However, let's just say I'm wrong about that, and the in order of that is in there. I don't think that's still. I still don't think what you have there is this type of sort of utilitarian, claim that would suggest that somehow God's just I just need somebody to heal, so I'm gonna smite a guy randomly and perpetrate an evil just so I have somebody to heal when I send my son or something like that. And this ties in pretty well with a way of, fleshing out and illustrating the thing that I just said about medieval ethics. So Origen, again, I want to say this might be in the same chapter in De Principii. I think it is. But one of the things that Origen talks about in there is that he talks about the fact that there are certain times when God does, in fact, perpetrate certain types of evil. Now, I did talk about this. I know I talked about this at some point in the series, that when saying that God permits evil or when saying that God does not create evil and things like that, that does not mean that there are never times where God inflicts some kind of an evil, like a physical evil upon somebody, a trial, a pain, sends judgment or something like that. Clearly, God does. However, this goes to the very sort of the moral sense that I was just talking about in the medievals. So Origen talks about the fact that he uses the analogy of someone like a physician. And when we're talking about a physician, right, we could talk about the sort of activity that a physician deals in, which is like cutting open a body and ripping out organs and things like that. And clearly this is a physical evil. If we're assessing this in the sort of ontological sense, this is contrary to the well-being of the body in the sense that you are inflicting some sort of harm. You're severing flesh, you're ripping things out. You're doing things that are in some ways doing damage and would constitute a physical evil to that organism. However, under certain circumstances, that physical evil may actually be the morally upright thing to do. So, for example, and these are the sorts of things that we deal in all the time when you're talking about medical ethics. If an organ is cancerous, yes, it is an evil to the body, contrary to proper formation, to cut open its flesh and to take that organ and to take it out of the body. That is a physical evil to the body. And yet, because you're in a circumstance where leaving that cancerous organ and that cancer is going to spread and ultimately kill the body, what you have here is you have a circumstance in which that physical evil inflicted on the body is actually the morally upright thing to do, because at the end of the day, this actually is in the interest of the overall health and well-being of the individual who, is suffering that physical evil. And so this is exactly the sort of thing, actually, that under the medieval ethics that they're talking about, that because evil is attached to both choices here, neglecting the organ, not perpetrating the physical evil, means the death of the entire person. This great evil, whereas taking it out, right, means inflicting a certain physical evil, but a physical evil that is temporary and can be healed, and in this sense, bring about the well-being and the flourishing of the individual. That that physical evil, that temporary physical evil that you'd inflict, is actually the morally upright thing to do. And that's the sort of thing that Origen is actually illustrating when he talks about God's perpetration of certain types of evils, sending certain types of evils, or orchestrating certain types of evil, like talked about in Isaiah. And so that sort of thing there is where Origen is saying, like, you don't look at the physician and say, well, he's committing some sort of evil act by doing this. You recognize that there is a physical evil being perpetrated on the person, but you also recognize that this is the morally upright thing to do. And this is precisely the sort of thing that Origen understands to be the case, and that ends up being echoed by the Eastern Fathers, that other Eastern Fathers like Basil and like Gregory and others, who want to suggest that, yes, God does send trials. He does permit certain sufferings. He does permit certain evils to come upon certain peoples. But when God does this, he does this in the manner of the physician, which is ultimately aimed at the good of the creature, ultimately aimed at the good of the whole of creation and the redemption of all things, and so on. And this goes to, so first of all, I'll just say, in the broad sense, I would say that even if I was wrong, and that passage, for example, does have an in order that in there, and it's setting up some sort of causal intention or something like that, I don't know that in order that gets you to the utilitarian reading, because obviously there's a complex story here. We don't know the story of this guy's parents. We don't know anything about his story beyond just the fact that, when Jesus shows up on the scene, he's born blind. And so we only sort of get that tail end of the story. So we don't actually have the sort of information to make the case that says, aha, see, in order that, therefore utilitarian. You don't have that sort of thing. And this actually goes to another principle that I think is worth talking about, which is just how the Eastern Fathers recommend that we read Scripture and the way it talks about God. So one of the things that I find very interesting is that when you look at how the Eastern Fathers approach the biblical text, they have a disposition to say, well, we come to the biblical text knowing that God is good and that he is just and that he is provident and so on. And if our reading of the text ends up leading to the conclusion that God is none of those things, then we're misreading the text. And you can see this in a couple of places. So once again, to hearken to Origen, I think it's in his commentary on Romans. Might also be in that passage in De Principii. But basically, when he considers the story of Pharaoh, he comes across the very sort of thing that troubles so many people when they read Romans 9. And where Paul's talking about Pharaoh, and he's talking about, God hardening his heart and vessels of wrath and vessels of mercy and all this sort of thing. And one of the things that Origen looks at is he's like, well, I mean, you could read this passage as suggesting that God, basically hardens Pharaoh's heart, making him disobey, and then punishing him for disobeying. But that would obviously be unjust. And the fact of the matter is, we all intuitively know that's unjust. That's exactly why people are troubled by Romans 9, because they read it and they go, it sounds like, is it actually saying that God's like making Pharaoh disobey and then punishing him for disobeying? And why is that troubling to them? Well, because it would obviously be unjust. He can't be morally held culpable for doing something like disobeying God if it was not in his power to obey God, right? Like that would clearly be unjust. And Origen, for that reason, when he talks about this, he's like, well, you could read it that way, but that's obviously unjust, so it's not even worth considering that as interpretation. And he just dismisses it out of hand. And this is what he moves toward instead, is he moves toward the reading that folks, who listen to me regularly, they've probably heard me talk about, where he talks about the idea that if the sun, S-U-N, could talk, it could talk about I cause to grow, and flourish, I cause to wither and crack. And it wouldn't be saying that it's dealing with the soil differently. It would just be identifying a difference in the soil itself and how it reacts to, the presence of the sun. And so in the same way, when we look at God and the hardening of Pharaoh, his cracking, his destruction is brought about simply by God revealing himself. And then, as is noteworthy, God treats Moses in the exact same way, showing up, revealing himself, proving it by miracle, offering a command. And Moses becomes a saint and Pharaoh ends up destroyed. So Origen, the way he reads this, and then this ends up echoed in other fathers like the Cappadocians, is that really at the end of the day, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart is really just sort of an unveiling of his disposition toward God when God unveils himself, just like Moses is revealed to be somebody who is of a godly disposition. That's why he becomes a saint. And so that's part and parcel of how they read that and why they dismiss out of hand the sort of more what would be considered more of a Calvinistic reading of what's being talked about there in Romans 9. But this is far from the only place. There's a lot of intriguing things that the Eastern Fathers have to say about how you should read Scripture. And I think it's in Gregory of Nyssa's homilies on the Lord's Prayer, where he talks about this. There's a section where he talks about how you're supposed to read Old Testament passages, where it sounds like God is sort of driven by bloodlust and contempt for certain people groups and things like that. And Gregory basically says, look, it would be blasphemous. It would actually be blasphemous to go ahead and attribute such things to God. And so what he suggests is that the way you should read these things is you should read them in the light of what we know about God's providential goodness and so on. So when, for example, it talks about, wiping out the wicked, so that, you will look for them and you can't find them and their place remembers them no more, in language like that. And Gregory of Nyssa suggests that the way you should read that is that from the divine side, the divine disposition to utter such things is driven by a desire for the redemption. Because if all the wicked, repented, let's say, then what would happen is as you search the earth for them, you wouldn't find any wicked. And their place would remember them no more. You would seek them and you wouldn't find them. Why? Because there are no more wicked people. What you have are righteous people now. And so in terms of reading these passages in the light of what we know of God, Gregory of Nyssa insists that's the way, that's what you should see in these sorts of passages from the divine side. I mean, is it possible that somebody could assert such a thing and mean something very different than God? That they would wish for God to smite the wicked and so on, in a sort of vengeful sense? Sure, I think it's entirely possible they could wish for that sort of thing. Obviously, if we look at the contrast between the prophet Jonah and we look at God, his disposition toward Nineveh, they have very different dispositions. Jonah definitely wants God to smite the wicked and wipe them out. And yet, God doesn't want that. He wants the repentance. And it's actually the difference between Jonah and God, which is why Jonah flees, right? Anyway, there we go. So I would say that the same thing holds true, that whenever we approach something like this sort of text, when we see Christ healing the blind man, the same sort of principle would be advocated by the Eastern Fathers. Either the text doesn't actually say that this was done in order that, or if it's there, the in order that should probably be read, not probably, it should be read in the light of what is said about, the way in which God, if he sends an evil, the way in which he does so, which is in the manner of the physician. So there we go. Okay. What do we have next? Okay. This next question I'm actually not going to read out loud. I actually find the framing a little distasteful, but I think the question is a valid one. Basically, it's essentially just asking if some horrible thing were going to happen to somebody you love, wouldn't you stop it? So why doesn't God? And I do think, first of all, I'll just say that in terms of a point that I made throughout the series, and definitely in the first episode on the problem of evil, is that I do think, this is really, at the end of the day, the beating heart of why people find the problem of evil so troubling. And they find it so troubling because they look at horrible things that happen to people they love, people they don't love, but if they project, and that was somebody that I did love, I would definitely stop it. So how could God ever, sort of allow this thing to transpire? And in fact, I think that's also one of the things, and I've made this point in my lectures on the religiously unaffiliated, right? The nuns, N-O-N-E-S. I've pointed out that when you interview the religiously unaffiliated and you talk about the sorts of things that set them on their heels theologically or religiously, they'll oftentimes name the problem of evil. Now, oftentimes, as I've also pointed out, they're really talking about the problem of divine hiddenness. But oftentimes they will talk about, suffering and pain and why doesn't God intervene? And I wanted God to intervene and he doesn't, and so on. And it's interesting because you can see this, and I've shown this actually in lectures on this, where you play back to back a certain type of clip where it's like you can hear the very same person who has abandoned religion say in one breath, when you're talking about religion, that one of the reasons they started to doubt is because they would some horrible thing happened, and they'd ask mom or dad like why, and mom and dad would say like, well, everything happens for a reason. They'd be like, why? And that just didn't make any sense to them. And then you jump ahead to their current sort of disposition, and they definitely believe in a higher power. They believe in karma, fate. Things happen for a reason. Now, you could look at that and you could laugh and be like, oh, that's dumb, But I actually think if you scrutinize what's being said, you find something really interesting, which is that they move away from talking about God, which is a person, and they start to talk about a higher power, or they talk about fate. And I think the reason why that becomes more comfortable is because karma or fate or a higher power, some sort of abstract principle, it offers them a way of depersonalizing it. And so it allows you to say, well, there isn't a person watching this happen who could have intervened and didn't. That's the thing that's repugnant. But there are cosmic forces, sort of blind cosmic indifferent forces that orchestrate the world, broadly toward justice, rewarding the righteous and punishing the wicked. That's usually what they mean by karma. They don't mean the actual Hindu concept. But that what goes around comes around. And I think that's actually sort of the key of why they move toward this more sort of depersonalized picture of God, because it becomes really difficult to accept the idea that God would somehow watch something happen and not intervene. Not step in, not stop it. Because wouldn't you? And wouldn't you? Because clearly, you are. If you were a good person, if there's any amount of goodness in you, you don't even have to be all good just to have any amount of goodness. You certainly would intervene. You wouldn't let that happen. So how can you say that God is all good and all just and somehow lets that fly? Now, I just want to say a couple of things about this. The first thing I'll just say by way of prelude, I don't think it's ever safe for anyone to try to schematize evils and offer some sort of explanation such that I can say, well, this thing happened for this specific reason. I don't think that's a good idea. The fact of the matter is this is the basis of what's sometimes called skeptical theism. I think like Van Inwagen would be a philosopher of religion today who's sort of associated with that type of thing, where really they're sort of acknowledging the sorts of things that I talked about when I was talking about the concomitance and incompossibility. I was talking about the complex web of interconnecting things, and how when you start to ask, like, could God make a human being? And we so casually say yes, and then we ask, okay, well, but what does a human being need? Well, a human being is a being that requires oxygen, so it would need an oxygen-rich environment. It has eyes for seeing, which requires some sort of light. He needs very specific temperature control, and so on and so forth. Basically, once you start to investigate, like, what does it take to make a human being, and then in order to create those conditions in a way that's conducive to a human being, what do those conditions require, and so on. Before you know it, when you sort of play out these thought experiments, you start to realize, well, maybe making just one human being requires an entire cosmos, and maybe a cosmos very much like ours. Like maybe that's part of the answer. And then it gets more complicated when you ask questions about, like, well, what does it mean to make Dr. Jacobs? Well, and you scrutinize the fact that Dr. Jacobs is not just a generic human being bearing that name, but I am somebody who, it's woven into my very being that I am the product of my particular parents. Well, and then you follow that train of thought through, not only to their union, not only to my conception, perhaps at that particular time in that particular way, then you start to ask the necessary conditions for them. And now you start to follow that to their parents and those conditions and so on and so forth. And before you know it, you realize, well, bringing about Dr. Jacobs requires an entire history a very specific history. And maybe it's not an immutable history in the sense that nothing could be different, but certainly there are certain indispensable components of that history in order to bring about me. And so anyway, that's the sort of thing that Leibniz talked about in the context when we were talking about was it episode 3? That I was talking about Leibniz and incompossibility and concomitance and those sorts of complexities. You start to realize that we very casually talk about what God could and couldn't do, and very casually talk about, modifying things that we don't like without any sort of clear sense of the real ramifications of that. And skeptical theism is basically acknowledging that. It's acknowledging that our actual understanding of the nature of the cosmos, our actual understanding of the ramifications of adjusting one thing, is extraordinarily limited. Basically to a vanishing small, point that amounts to not knowing anything about it. And so in this sense, skeptical theism just says we don't really even have enough information to indict God, because the information is too vast and too complicated for us to make a real assessment of whether or not God ought to have done otherwise. And I think there is some amount of wisdom in that, in recognizing that. And I do think that's a big part of the book of Job, where Job claims to have some amount of understanding, and that's what he's indicted for. And that's one of the reasons why God ends up grilling him with 77 questions, right? To show that he really knows. The 77 is clearly symbolic, right? Completion. And so when you go from 7, right, completion to 77, right, you completely know nothing, Job, where he asks him all of these different questions, and it's not in order to say like, just shut up. But it is to say that the only place where Job missteps is at some point by indicting God, he ends up claiming knowledge. And that's what Job says about himself at the end of the book. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on Job, you could, again, go to my Leibniz book. There's actually an opening chapter. There's not an opening chapter. The opening of one of my chapters, I spend a good amount of time on the book of Job in order to sort of frame up the discussion of that chapter. So the first thing I would just say is, whenever it comes to these sorts of particularities, of course, the very human impulse is to say, of course I would stop it. But I think that goes to the very fact that for us, we have a very small sphere of sovereignty, to use a certain type of language. We have a very small sort of sliver of the world that we're responsible for. And in this sense, we really don't have an understanding of the sort of full-blown cosmic duties that God has. And so in that sense, we don't really have the appropriate information in order to say what we would have done were we God or something like that. And so I think there's some wisdom in skeptical theism in beckoning us to remember that. The second thing, that's the first thing I would say, is just that this does go to a vast difference between me and God, in the sense that I am not God, and I am a very small creature who has a very small estate in this world. So just because I would intervene, and I would, doesn't mean that God ought to have. That's one thing. The other thing I would just point out, and this is something that I pointed out in another episode, which is that I think the impulse to say God ought to have, and therefore there is no God, which is obviously where the problem of evil wants to go, I think misses some very critical things about it. And some of the things that it misses is the very fact that our visceral response to the evil actually is a testimony to the goodness of the thing affected. And so I talked about this, when talking about the brothers Karamazov, and the fact that Ivan Karamazov ends up giving these sort of grotesque stories, horrifying stories about like infant murder. And his point is obviously to try to usher forth the problem of evil in a very visceral and palpable way. And it's effective. But I think the problem is, what we oftentimes miss is the point that's been made in a number of these episodes about the nature of evil as a privation. The fact of the matter is that what makes that evil so palpable is that it's perpetrated upon an infant, right? So there's something that is extremely innocent, something that's extremely precious, something that's extremely pure and beautiful, something that is an extraordinary good, and especially to those who have had the privilege of being parents understand that extraordinary good, having held their own children in their arms. That the thought of somebody aggressively, wreaking havoc or pain or violence upon something like that, that part of the world is something that churns the stomach and defies the imagination. But the reason it does that is because the extraordinary goodness of the thing that's being harmed. And in this sense, I think you have a couple of things that need to be remembered. I've pointed out before that I really do think one of the problems with the problem of evil is that when you move from the problem of evil, which is a very good problem and one worth asking because it tells us a lot about the nature of the world and the nature of God, that when you look at it and your impulses say there is no God and you move toward atheism, I think you end up cutting out the legs of the argument, because the sort of evil and the sort of good that we're talking about can't exist in the world of the atheist. If the world is just sort of random matter in motion, and consciousness and moral judgments are really sort of after products, side effects that emerge out of this sort of chaos developmentally over time, then all that we're calling good and evil and just and fairness and projecting backwards on the world is a mental chimera. It's an invention. It's something that we project on the world but isn't really there. And the entire case from the problem of evil has to do with the palpable reality of evil. And so since that sort of palpable evil and that palpable goodness that goes with it can't exist within the world of the atheist, to move toward atheism is problematic. It becomes self-referentially incoherent, where you're rightly identifying a problem, you're rightly identifying the impact of that problem, but your conclusion undermines your premises, that evil exists. And so I would say that, first of all, sort of the palpable nature of evil doesn't allow to move from, this thing being permitted or happening to the idea that there is no God. Because I don't think evil of the kind the problem presumes can exist in the world of the atheist. But I think also what's also testified to there is the very thing that is affirmed by the Christians, which is the innate nature of the world is good. And that when we're talking about evil, we're talking about a twisting or a violation of a certain order that is inherently good. And that really is, that's the sort of thing that's testified to in that sort of event, right? Both the evil is very real, but the reason the evil is so palpable is because the good of the world is so real as well. If it were less good, right, it would be less potent. Just like I talked about, tearing up a small doodle is a very small evil, if it's an evil at all, whereas attacking, Michelangelo's Pietà with a sledgehammer is a great evil. And that has to do with the sort of proportional goodness. The greater the goodness, the greater the evil is that's perpetrated against it. And so I think that's something that needs to be recognized there. And then at the end of the day, and I don't want to be redundant and drag these things out, but I did talk about this. I think it was maybe in episode 4 where I was talking about once you face those sorts of things, you face a certain question. So if you can't move toward atheism, then you're only left with metaphysical dualism, that there are two principles, good and evil, that are at war. You're left with deism, where you do have a world that has good and evil, and maybe you even embrace a privative view of evil the way the Christians do, but you just suggest that God is removed and not concerned with the world, or you go with the Christian view. And I talked about in that episode why I've talked about it in the past, I think it was probably in episode 1, I talked about why I think metaphysical dualism is problematic and doesn't function. And I also talked about, why I think deism is also problematic. And so what I think you're really left with is theism. And then that leaves you with this question of, why God doesn't intervene. And here, this is where I think the broader narrative having to do with the genuine self-determination of creatures, with the long story of humanity, the fact that these stories and how they play out are not really sort of ended, right? You're only looking at a very small first chapter whenever you look at these individual events. Is something that is a very sort of myopic picture of it, and that we really do need to consider the long story in the whole. I'm not going to revisit all of that because, well, I talked about that at length in this series, and to rehash it all here would be to carry us well beyond a Q&A episode. But there you go. That's some, at least some initial material on that one. All right, what do we have next? I'm interested in how natural disasters might fit into this discussion. Okay, so yes, so natural disasters. Once again, I would again always beckon caution against being too prescriptive with regard to any of these things. All of these different sort of aspects of the Eastern patristic narrative that's there, they're not there in order for you to sit there and diagnose every bad thing that might befall a person and say, oh, this is why it happened. Like, we are not Job's comforters. We shouldn't go that route. Like, that's not the way this should go. But these do offer some amount of explanation that help us understand how these things may well fit in the sort of world that we live in, while it is also governed by a good and provident God. One of the things that I did talk about is I talked about the fact that within Eastern patristic thought, you can find a lot of different declarations about the role of ministering spirits and the sorts of things that the angels, the archangels, all the company of heaven are entrusted with. And obviously we're familiar with, guardian angels, the idea of them being entrusted with humans, maybe we're less familiar with, but maybe recognize it. Certain things like the fact that there are certain angels who are entrusted or over certain nations. You see this like in Daniel, right, where an angel shows up and he apologizes for being late because he got in a tussle with the Prince of Persia, which is another celestial being. And so you have those sorts of things. You also have, and again, like all of these things are basically patristic receptions of certain Jewish traditions that are also then echoed in not just the Bible, Old Testament, but also in the New Testament. They basically see angels as caretakers who are entrusted with things like animals and animal birth, and also as well as the elements. And so at least one patristic explanation that starts to emerge for things like natural disasters is the fact of demonic powers, right? And the idea that you do have the possibility that the God of this world and other ministering spirits who are active as beings who have been entrusted with certain natural features of the world and retain that dominion, may well, in fact, perpetrate certain evils upon the world and utilize those aspects of the natural world against us. Now, that's not to say that that's what every natural disaster is, right? Obviously, we see instances in the Bible where, like I brought up the story of the prophet Samuel, and I talked about the fact that when he's sitting there and he's talking to Israel, and he's like, and in order that you may know what a wicked thing you've done, and then he like summons wind and rain and storm and terrifies them. So obviously we do have examples of God, stirring the elements in a way that has a very specific intent as well. Like in that case, it was in order to induce fear and help them to realize, wow, we really sinned against God and we're very small creatures and we shouldn't have done that. And so it's not to say that it's always demonic, but it is to say that the demonic does offer one possible explanation. And so again, always beckoning against us claiming to know the specific reason why a thing befell us. We shouldn't sit there and be like, well, God has done this thing because he's calling down judgment on the city or something like that. That's not always necessarily the explanation of what might happen. But I would say that, amongst the possible explanations is the fact that the God of this world is, well, the devil. And actually on this point, I will just say, like, this is something that I didn't touch on too much, but I do think it's an important point, which is that the idea that we are in a world that's engaged heavily in demonic dominion and spiritual warfare and things like that is an important aspect of the Eastern patristic narrative. So you've probably, if you've listened to me talk about the story of Mary, whether that was in the episode on the Netflix Mary or something else, when I talk about that story, I've talked about the fact that for the Eastern Church Fathers, and you see this throughout, Ignatius and others, it's ubiquitous in the early Christian narrative, that, you see amongst the traditions about Mary, one of the things that comes up again and again is the role of the devil within that narrative. And one of the traditions that comes up there is the very fact that the devil was aware of the prophecies about the coming Messiah. And for that reason, he's watching the maidens of Israel. And that's one of the reasons why Mary was betrothed to Joseph, partially in order to hide her from the devil. And then obviously also within the fishhook theory, right, the theory that I've talked about in terms of atonement, the idea that Christ, what he is doing is, he is in some ways, enticing the devil to go ahead and try to slay him, because entering, the realm of the dead, his death will be, the devil's undoing, as he who has life in himself enters the realm of the dead, and all of that sort of stuff. Those sorts of things, what you see is that the demonic powers and the devil play an important part of the narrative. And I know that there's an entire series by Gregory Boyd, who is an open theist, and so, and he's a Protestant. So there's lots of things about his theology I wouldn't endorse. I think he's been right to actually try to draw this aspect of theodicy into the fore. He did this with his book, God at War and Satan and the Problem of Evil. I don't know if there's a third in that series. I think it might just be those two. But those were specifically, he was developing what I think he called a warfare theodicy, where he's just sort of talking about the importance of the demonic to, looking at the evils that befall our world, as opposed to what starts to emerge later in a very modernist notion, where there's this tendency toward deism, where it's just like, well, God schematizes the world. He makes a blueprint for what he wants to happen within the world, and he just sort of runs the computer program and things like that, and it's all ultimately traceable to God. I think Boyd, in his own way, is trying to get back to the fact, which is very much part and parcel of the Eastern patristic notion, that free self-determination is very real, and it's a very real part of our world. It's a very real part of the fact that as part of God's designs, free creatures play a significant role, and for that reason, the narrative is really played out in a way that honors and interacts in a synergistic way with the free choices of creatures, and that includes things like the demonic. And I just add one last thing here, which is the point that I made in one of the episodes here. I think it was either episode 4 or 5 when I was talking about the Eastern patristic narrative. One of the natural questions is always just like, why doesn't God, get rid of the demons? Like, if they're going to create so many problems, why doesn't he just get rid of them? Now, two things here. One, we should be cautious about saying that anything that goes corrupt, God should just toss in the cosmic trash bin, because we would be on the list. But the other thing that we should be cautious about there is that, well, it's not so much caution as much as I think it's a misunderstanding, or it misses an important point, which is the point that I made in those episodes, which is that God, divine providence, at least as looked at and interpreted in Eastern patristic thought, divine providence actually operates in accord with the order of nature. It doesn't violate it. And so we can see this when we consider the nature of miracles and things like that God is essentially sort of moving things back toward proper formation, health, and wholeness, not sort of overturning the order of nature. And you see this obviously in the person of Christ, who all of his miracles, everything that he's doing in terms of the incarnation as understood by the Eastern Church Fathers, is he's entering humanity in order to heal it and restore it and set it back right. And this is where I've made the point before that what's noteworthy about this fact is that, when God does work a miracle, he doesn't sort of rip out the cancerous organ. If we had a person who has a brain tumor and it's going to kill them, and God works a miracle and he makes the tumor go away, what he does is he restores the brain to wholeness, right? The thing that is unnatural, which is the tumor, is the thing that is obliterated and the brain is set right. What God doesn't do is rip out the brain and say, well, now you're just going to miraculously operate without a brain. So it's actually always a restoration of nature. And the reason that's important is because the demons occupy the place they have in the cosmos for good reason. The cosmic organism includes them, right? The large creature that is the cosmos. It has as part of its structure the angels. And so even when they're corrupt and fallen, they're still part of that cosmic organism. And so in keeping with that, that's why what you don't see happen is that God just sort of like rips them out of their place in the cosmos and tosses them away. Instead, what you see is the very long narrative of God continuing to move the cosmos toward its proper formation, health, and wholeness, the incarnation being the sort of cornerstone of this plan, in order to bring it back to its proper, formation and right ordering. He doesn't just start to rip out parts that are cancerous and throw them away. Okay, what do we have next? Okay. Oh, well, look at that. Why doesn't God just get rid of the demons? Okay, so that one's been addressed. Okay, what else do we have? So we have here a question about my use of the language of Judeo-Christian, whether or not the rabbis actually do affirm the sort of thing that I talk about. Okay, and privation of evil. Okay, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit trail, but I'll just offer something very quickly so people know when I'm talking about the Jewish and the Christian idea. Obviously, within the church fathers, they look at Judaism primarily in the sense of the Old Testament. And so they're acknowledging that there is, when I'm talking about Judaism, they're acknowledging that they are, receiving the substance of something that was a shadow of things to come. And yes, of course, I do see in Alexandrian Judaism, which is primarily handed down to us through Philo, but through the sort of limited sources we have in Alexandria. That's one of the reasons, why it's thought that Philo represents a certain brand of Judaism, though we have limited information because that's what happens when the Alexandrian library burns down. So there is still sort of an antecedent, not just within the biblical text. But of course, when you're talking about, when I talk about Judeo-Christian, I am not necessarily talking about Talmudic, Judaism, something later. Very clearly, and again, I don't want to get too sidetracked on this. I do think that there's a very sort of strange tendency to try to look to sort of later Talmudic Judaism as if and somehow that gives us the proper lenses to read the New Testament. I actually don't think that's true. It's very clear that there is a turn that starts to happen as Christianity is coming onto the scene, where what you're seeing is an overt sort of effort to de-Christianize Judaism and fortify it. There's an elevation of the importance of Hebrew. There's a sneering at Greek, which didn't exist. You can look at Martin Hengel's work on this, on Judaism and Hellenism. That was not the case around the time of Christianity. So there's this sort of elevation of of the Hebrew language. There's sort of a cultural insulation that starts to happen that wasn't sort of as prominent before that. There's also a sort of resistance to pagan philosophy because there's this recognition that pagan philosophy is moving in a certain direction. And so you see, and then with that, you see this sort of anti-Christian impulse that emerges with that. And so that's where I always think it's a very strange thing to project that backwards on the New Testament or something like that, and suggest that somehow that's Judaism sort of writ large, or Judaism sort of uncorrupted or something like that, or Pharisaical Judaism or something like that. But I know that that is a tendency within biblical studies to be like, well, Paul was a Pharisee, and so therefore Pharisaical Judaism, and we're going to, by that, we're going to take some later tradition and project it backwards, must be the backdrop for the things that Paul is saying. I think that's very weird. I think it's very weird for a couple of reasons. Partially, like I said, because I don't think that's actually in keeping with pre-Christian Judaism. I think there's clearly changes happening. I also think it's weird because Paul converted. My mother, if somebody was reading my thought much later and they were like, well, that his mother was a German Lutheran. So I do think reading Francis Pieper and Martin Luther and, and Gerhard and these other sort of German Lutherans, that's the key to understanding Jacob's thought. Well, not really. Definitely not really. Because it might be helpful in the sense of some of the stuff that I know. But some of the cultural stuff that I might know, but it's not relevant in terms of understanding the actual formation of my theology. And I do think when you look at somebody like St. Paul, he converted. And as somebody who converted and realized he was wrong, he was going to have to wrestle and rethink a lot of what he thought. That's one of the reasons why I think Alexandrian Judaism, as far as we know it, is more like likely, sits in the background of a lot of things that we find in Paul and in John and others, because at the end of the day, now that the substance has come, when the Christians started looking at the various factions of Judaism, and there were a lot of factions of Judaism that didn't all agree by any stretch. Just think of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, that basically when they had to look at, who is right now that the substance has come, the answer is probably like, well, the Alexandrian Jews actually got it pretty stinking close, man. So anyway, so all that's to say, though, I still want to acknowledge that Christianity is a fulfillment of a Jewish faith that was handed down. So when I'm using Judeo-Christian, I'm using it in that sense. I'm not using it in some sort of like, all the way up through time, in memoriam, sort of something like that, where as Christianity and Judaism diverge from one another, that this is still like a Judeo-Christian tradition or something like that. I'm just acknowledging that Christianity is the fulfillment, the substance of the shadow that anticipated. So, okay, what else do we have? Let's see. I believe you asked for final questions regarding the problem of evil. I'm wondering why I've never heard the problem of evil handled by positing a malicious supreme deity. Sorry, I changed it to deity. Malicious supreme being. Why doesn't anyone use the argument that evil exists because God, in scare quotes, is ultimately malicious and sadistic and impetuous? It seems like a simple argument to make on the surface, but I've never heard even one person argue this. Can you comment on why this is? Okay. So I would say a couple of things here on this. I think I've actually already kind of addressed this in other episodes. If you listen to all 12 hours of them or whatever it is. Not that I'm going to fault anybody for not doing that, but I would say a couple of things. First of all, I think metaphysically there's something problematic about the idea of this type of a solution, but we'll come back to this. I actually do think this is kind of a Homeric solution in some ways. So it's rather interesting if you look at the Homeric gods. You don't really have a sort of writ large good and evil in the sense that that you get later on. And this is actually part of the problem. This is part of the problem that Plato points out in the Euthyphro dilemma when Socrates, is asking Euthyphro, this fellow traveler, who's on his way to the trial of his father. He's like, and Euthyphro seems to have discovered the way of virtue, and Socrates wants to know, well, how? And he says, well, you do as the gods do. And this is very disappointing to Socrates because he recognizes that the gods all behave very differently, and there's almost sort of like this tribalistic type thing. And it's not really until in Hesiod you start to get this sense of like a cosmic order that's above the gods, where it's like I submit to this thing that's above them. And this is where you get into the sort of problem that I think this raises the same sort of problem, the idea that God is just sort of vicious and malevolent. I think it gets into the same problem that was identified as the underlying problem of metaphysical dualism from a philosophical perspective, which is to say, and this is the point that I said C.S. Lewis makes at one point, which I think is quite right, which is to say that if you're going to look at two deities and you're going to say this one is good and this one is evil, right? That's the nature of the two deities. You have this metaphysical dualism, two principles. The thing is, what you're going to have to say is you're either going to have to say that I prefer what this one prefers, right? And in that sense, you're just sort of doing something tribal. This one likes this way of being, that one likes that way of being. I prefer this one's lifestyle instead. And so I'm siding with them, and I'm calling them good in a sort of subjective preferential way. But that's obviously not what's being claimed by metaphysical dualism. And so what you actually have to say is that one of them, is actually doing real good and the other one is actually doing real evil. But the problem here that you run into is that, no one does evil for evil's sake, right? We do a good or we do an evil because we see something good in it. And this goes to the entire privation view of evil that's defended by the Christians. And so at the end of the day, what you would have to say is you'd have to say that this being is conducting himself in this way because he thinks that's good. And this being is conducting himself in that way because he thinks that's good. but this one is correct and that one's incorrect. So this one is actually good and that one's actually evil. So then you'd have to identify something that's above both of them, and that, as C.S. Lewis points out, then that would be the real God, right? That thing that actually judges and adjudicates between them. And this is one of the reasons why pagan philosophy ultimately starts to lean toward the idea that there's only a single principle, like the main principle is God, who is also the good, who produces all things, and then evil is ultimately a twisting or corrupting of it. And I think that's quite right. And so the problem you run into is if we were to say, well, there's this God, and this God is corrupt and twisted and, whatever it may be, you're going to ultimately have to start to run into this claim of saying, corrupt and twisted relative to what? And you're going to have some sort of higher principle. And in this sense, you're still not talking about God. You're talking about some sort of sub-being, right, sub-deity, that has gone awry and is at odds with it, which is exactly what Christianity posits with regard to the fallen angels, that they are sort of God-like beings, these celestial beings that have gone wrong and are twisted and are wreaking havoc on things. But above them is the source of all, who is the good, which is God himself. So anyway, I think I've touched on that in other episodes, so hopefully that suffices for this context. What do we have next? Are there evil archetypes? Okay, of course, a Jungian psychologist would answer, but are there? If evil is a distortion, every evil archetype is just a distortion as well. Seeing archetypes as universal driving forces and not just as some form of prototypes, can they really be distorted? Do they not reach deeper than distortion? Is there not always still a deeper level uncorrupted even in the most evil archetype? Okay, so this is a much larger question, and I suspect that this question might be perhaps conflating some of the sort of Jungian notions of archetypes that float about because of Jordan Peterson or something like that, with forms or archetypes in that sense, in the Platonic sense of realism, like I tend to talk about. I'm not convinced those are the same things, but that would be its entire, its own episode about that. But if we're going to just frame it in the realist sense, of just sort of asking, like, is there a form of evil? The answer is no. And this is actually one of the I think this is actually goes to a number of practical issues, and these issues largely have to do with diagnostics. But, when we talk about sort of properly formed, malformed, it's interesting that you consider a circle, right? There is only one correct way to draw a circle, which is where all points are in equal distance from a common century. So if you do that, right, you have a properly formed circle, but there's an infinite number of ways to diverge from it. And so we can start to sort of conceptually impose certain boundary lines of certain types of, certain mental placeholders, nominal constructs, for certain types of divergence. If there's a bulge to the upper right hand side, right? Something like that. And we can start to just sort of invent these sort of names and mental groupings for that sort of thing that aren't really real. Now, they're related to something real because we have a concept of circle and we have a concept of malformed, right, that it is divergent from. But once we've moved into divergent form or corrupt, we're actually not moving toward a form. This is a mode of moving away from a form. And so in this sense, you're actually talking about something privative. And I do think that one of the things that you find is one of the reasons why there's somebody I plan on having on in future episodes who's a PhD in psychology, and we've talked a lot about some of my critiques about, counseling psychology and things like that. And so we're going to go ahead and do a few episodes if we can manage to schedule him here. But one of the things that we've talked about is the challenge of diagnostics. And one of the challenges with diagnostics is actually that, you're sort of creating these boundary lines of certain tendencies and, like let's say a cluster B personality disorder. Well, you're really just saying there's a certain cluster of certain types of abnormal, and the very language it's embedded there, abnormal, right? Like a movement away from norm or malformed, right? These are terms that are, or deformed, right? All these terms indicate a divergence from proper formation. And so you're sort of grouping together and drawing a line around, like, well, when things are divergent from, proper formation in this area, we'll call this a cluster. of divergent properties, and we'll identify it accordingly, and then start to name these. But you don't really have a good way of a very precise way of engaging in diagnostics. And why? Well, because you're not really talking about a form. You're talking about a certain pattern under which broadly you can diverge from a form into some form of abnormality or deformity or poor health, right? Something like that. And so the short answer is no. There are not forms of evil. The forms are the proper formation. And when you're talking about evil, you're talking about twisting or corrupting or divergent. Now, you can still talk, when you're talking about story archetypes, this then gets into the territory of whether those sorts of story archetypes are in fact, forms in the way, that Plato would talk about forms. That's a bigger topic that we can talk about at some point, but not now, because that would be a whole episode. And then, you can also talk about, in these patterns, when we're talking about certain patterns of a certain type of villain, are we really talking about a type of villain, a form of villain, or are we just talking about similar, like I said about cluster B, where you're identifying a certain type of malformation, somebody who is super genius, very clever, things like that. Those are the goods that they have. And so when those things get twisted and go awry, this is the type of villain that we're talking about. But again, notice that the things I've identified are the goods that they have that then become twisted as they become an evil character and so on. But again, this is just sort of touching on a few points. That would be a whole episode unto itself. All right, what else do we have? Do we have time for a few more questions? I think maybe we have time for one or two more. Let's see. Okay, let's see. We got a long question here on body-soul dualism. Yeah, basically sort of reading over this. Okay. Essentially it's sort of pressing the question of whether or not the Eastern Fathers really, when I talk, I sound like I'm talking like they are substance dualists. The questioner isn't using that language here. But yeah, okay, so asking whether or not they are substance dualists, where they think the body and the soul are two distinct substances, and questioning whether or not there is a single Eastern patristic view, and so on, and arguing that maybe somehow it's more like a holistic thing. They're using hylomorphic. I think they probably mean Aristotelian hylomorphism as interpreted by Thomas Aquinas. Okay. So just in answer to this question, yes, I actually do think the Eastern Church Fathers, I do think they have a consistent view that's consistent across the board with regard to them. And John of Damascus would agree with me on this, actually. So if you read on his Orthodox faith, where he talks about the view of the soul and the Orthodox faith, this is one thing that's very useful, because what John is doing, if you look at that work, John is doing an exact exposition of the Orthodox faith, and he's really clear that what he's trying to do is offer his consensus of the fathers, right, the Eastern Fathers before him, and add nothing to their teachings. So this is really how, when I usher forth something like John, what I find so useful about that text is this is John of Damascus's thoughts on whether there is a consensus of the Eastern Fathers on a certain topic. And it's interesting that when John thinks there's not, he actually acknowledges that. For example, he's sitting there going like, a question like, well, was the tree in Eden really a tree, right? And he'll actually talk about, there's the sort of allegorical reason that it's not a tree. There's the little read that it is a tree. Both of these exist in the fathers. And then he's like, and I don't actually see any reason why it can't be both, and things like that. And so John will acknowledge where he sees sort of a spectrum. Now, I'm not suggesting everywhere where he identifies a position, he identifies the spectrum. For example, with angels, he clearly sort of takes the majority reading of the fathers that angels are not redeemable. As I've talked about in this, there are, divergent positions, but John is clearly sort of towing the line with regard to the dominant consensus on that position. And if you look at what John has to say about the soul, he does indeed identify the soul as one substance and the body as another substance. And he takes this to be proved by the fact that the soul survives death and exists in an intermediate state on its own without the body. And he does identify each one as hylomorphic. If you want to see a sustained treatment of this, you could read my article. What is it called? It's something like, it's been a long time since I wrote that. I think it's called like, Is the Soul a form matter composite, a defense of pneumatic hylomorphism, something like that. Anyway, you can find that article. And I go there, in there, what I do is I actually do a brief history of the Eastern patristic view, and the idea that the soul itself is a form matter composite, that spirits in general are form matter composites, which is a consensus amongst the Eastern Fathers, and actually within the Arian dispute, it's very clear that they think every creature has to be that, and that is the consistent Eastern patristic view across the board. So I'd point you there, and then I talk about. Basically, I talk about the ways in which that view is slowly diverged from and explored in a variety of different ways in the Latin West. I talk about contemporary alternatives to body-soul dualism and things like that. I make my case in defense of the Eastern Fathers. So you could look at that article for that sort of thing. What I would say is that, yes, they do not hold the Thomist view, which the Thomist view is that the body is the substratum, the material, form matter composite, that the body is the matter and the soul is the form. They do not hold that view. Again, point you to that article on that. They do believe they are two distinct substances. Now, I think the problem is what a lot of folks who are unfamiliar with the Eastern patristic view of the hypostasis of the individual, they end up sort of thinking that this is somehow Cartesian, which is not. And what I mean by that is with Descartes in modernity, what you start to have is you do have this tendency to equate the individual with the soul. And this is sort of the boogeyman that a lot of people who want to sort of attack substance dualism are attacking, but it's actually utterly irrelevant to the Eastern Fathers. So Descartes, once he starts going through in his meditations, he talks about two different types of substance: a substance that extends in space, which becomes his sort of like material substance, and then thinking substance. And of course, thinking substance is the mind. That's the self in Descartes' meditations. And so what you start to get is that the self is the mind, and the mind is housed in a body, and then it can escape and things like that. And this is where you get the sort of notions of Platonism. Obviously, in Platonism, since the soul is ultimately meant to be liberated from the body, there's a sense in which, again, the soul is the real self that just has a body or something like that. All of these sorts of notions that somehow make the mind into the soul and make the soul into the self and then make the body some sort of appendage, all of that's divergent from, none of that has anything to do with the Eastern Church Fathers. And the reason it doesn't have to do with that is because when you look at their concept of the individual or the hypostasis, the subject, and here again, I'd point you to a different article. I'd point you to section 3 of my article on the metaphysical idealism of the Eastern Church Fathers, where I talk about the very thing I'm going to mention here. The individual, the notion of the subject or the individual, was something that was very underdeveloped in pagan philosophy. People like Aristotle and Plato and the Stoics and the Neoplatonists, they're so interested, so sort of obsessed with generics and common natures and things like that, properties, that the notion of what makes the individual an individual, what constitutes the individual, is a very sort of underexplored question. You find some speculation about it, but it's really sort of an aside that's not really super important to most of their metaphysics. So Aristotle's like, I don't know, I think it's where you run out of predicates. Have that makes you and things like that. But in the Eastern Church Fathers especially, the discussions of Trinity and Christology ended up forcing them to develop a concept of the individual, and this is what the term hypostasis actually is about, right? So in Basil's Epistle 38, which some people attribute to his brother Gregory, but it doesn't really matter, he ends up saying like, well, a nature is a pure abstraction. Human or cat or dog is a pure abstraction. The form is a pure abstraction, and it doesn't have any concrete existence. And having no concrete existence of its own, you never just see like human floating out in the air. It has no stasis, and so what it needs is a hypostasis, meaning something that's underneath it that sort of like gives it some sort of stability and concrete existence. And so this is where they begin to develop the concept of the subject being a non-repeatable, enduring entity, something that is the principle of existence that exists beneath concrete natures and has those natures. And this becomes critical not only to Trinitarian theology, where you're talking about several subjects who have a common nature. It also becomes integral to Christology, where the entire idea that you have two natures, both of which are abstractions, are just had by one subject. There's only one guy who has them and utilizes them. And so much of the confusion around Christology actually has to do with the tendency of a lot of people to look at natures as if they're things unto themselves, or if they act unto themselves. For example, in talking about Christ's divine and human will, they're like, well, if he's got a human will, can he will contrary to the divine will? And so on. And they sort of, in some ways, anthropomorphize or concretize human nature as if the nature of humanity wills stuff, but it doesn't. The individual who has the nature and thus has self-determination wills stuff. And there's only one guy, right? There's only one person who has the divine nature and who has the human nature, and he uses both. So in any given act, he is willing with both natures. But there's only one guy doing the willing. And that's why you don't have that sort of like worry that somehow the divine and the human might will contrary to each other, because ultimately there's only one guy, willing. And the worry itself is actually indicative of a mistake where you tend to think of his humanity as a human as opposed to as a nature, an abstract nature that the subject has and uses. And so the reason this is important is because a lot of times when people are worried that substance dualism means something like Platonism or Cartesianism, it's usually because they don't have an understanding of the hypostasis doctrine. But if you do, you understand, well, the hypostasis is the one who has a human nature, which is the general form that it has. And that human nature includes a lot of subnatures. You have the nature of an eye, which is in it. That's its own form. You have the nature of a lung, right? A human lung. That's its own form. And yes, you have the nature of the human body. And yes, you have the nature of the human soul. And the human soul is distinct from the human body. And it has all those things. But they're held together harmoniously in one nature, which is had by only one subject, which is the human person. And that's actually why, for example, the bodies of the saints or the body of Christ, right? When the soul separates from those, are still considered the body of that person. Because at the end of the day, the person is not the soul. The person is the subject who has those things. So if we cut off your arm and throw it across the room, it's still your arm. Because it is, those forms are, belong to you, the enduring subject. And so anyway, that's probably, again, a longer topic, but that's what I would identify as the sort of error in the worry that's there. And the fact of the matter is the Eastern Fathers do consistently, and again, I'd point you to that article, recognize that there is a body-soul distinction, just as there's an eye-lung distinction, that these are two distinct things that are part of all, that all belong to one nature, which is the nature human, which is had by one subject. And so that's very different, of course, than Descartes or Plato. Okay, let's see what else. Okay, we have a question on animal pain. I'm actually going to forego that partially because I think I did a pretty, if you're interested in this topic, animal pain. First of all, I think I devoted a good amount of time to this in episode 6. So I'm not going to revisit this. I think basically in order to flesh out my response to this further, it requires an entire episode. And I think I will do actually an entire episode on animals, animal death, animal immortality, right? Things like that. And so I think that's a worthwhile question, but I'm not going to deal with it here because I can't really deal with it here beyond what I already did in episode 6. So that one I'll deal with at greater length another time. Okay, and so with that, I actually think we are probably out of time here. I think we covered most of the questions. I know there's a couple of stragglers we didn't get to, but hopefully, everyone is deeply satisfied here on the 1-year anniversary of the Nathan Jacobs podcast. So as always, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Please please subscribe. If you have not, please leave a comment to help the algorithm. And also, please reach out to your friends and let's try it. Let's see if we can hit 3,000 subscribers before next week's episode so we can say at 1 year, we had 3,000 subscribers. So with that, thank you all. I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm, and also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.